Welcome to Mission Oriented, a VeteranCrowd podcast that showcases veteran talent from both the private and public sectors. Their impact is everywhere. We are here to uncover it. Here's your host, Bob Louthan.
Hey, welcome everybody. My guest today is no stranger to VeteranCrowd. Hoang has been a friend of mine and an advisor to me for quite a number of years. He's a veteran entrepreneur who's been on the founding teams of companies that have generated over $600 million of revenues and employed 1,200 professionals across a number of fields: law, aerospace, defense, government, and technology. France has also got a history of over 20 years of national security experience. He's a graduate of West Point, received a master's from Washburn University, got his law degree at Georgetown University, and managed to pass Ranger School and the CPA exam. There's a combination you haven't seen too often. France, thank you for being a guest once again on the podcast. Thanks so much for being here.
Hey, Bob, great to be here. Thanks for the introduction. I feel a lot of pressure not to suck on this podcast now, so hopefully I live up to that.
Well, it's always great to catch up with you, but France, I want to dive right into one thing. Back in early March, I saw your testimony in front of Congress, and the topic was about the evacuation from Afghanistan in 2021, and I was struck by your presentation. Just an interesting. It's just an interesting story. We're going to put some links to some of the video in the show notes from your presentation. But France, let's go back and talk about your experience. You went back into the Army after being out for a while with the I want to say the 20th Special Forces Group. Am I saying that correct?
That is correct. Yep.
I think you were lured back in by now Congressman at that point in time was probably Lieutenant Colonel Mike Waltz, but now Congressman from Florida. And so let's go back to that period of time in your life and why you made the decision to go back to Afghanistan. And then I think that sets the table for the discussion about what we're going to talk about, the evacuation from Afghanistan.
Yeah, sure, Bob. The story actually begins way before then. So I am myself a refugee. I was born in Saigon, Vietnam in 1973. My mother in 1975 worked for the U.S. Naval Attaché. My father was a South Vietnamese Army officer. And in April of 75, we were evacuated out of Saigon by U.S. forces just before communists took over South Vietnam. So I am here, right, as a result of one of the greatest acts in American history, right? The rescue, the resettlement of hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese after the Vietnam War. And growing up, I learned about my family's history. I had a chance to visit the Vietnam Wall, and I decided that I wanted to give back to this great country by serving in the very same military that rescued me, and that led to my decision to go to West Point. Fast forward many years, I've served my time in the Army. I'm now working in the White House. And, I had the opportunity once again to serve my country. And, not only did I want to, I felt I had to. It is a privilege to lead American sons and daughters in combat. I am not Special Forces, by the way. And so the opportunity to serve in a Special Forces unit, Special Forces officers slot, though not being what they call 18 Alpha qualified, is a rare opportunity. And I'm a West Point graduate, and just like you went to a military academy, this is what we do, right? We go to the sound of the guns. And so it was a tremendous opportunity in 2009 to be called back to active duty and to deploy and serve as the executive officer of Bravo Company's 2nd Battalion, 20th Special Forces Group.
This was no short period of time in between when you got out of the Army the first time and re-entered. How much time elapsed here?
Yeah. So it was 9 years, and even more than that, right? It's 9 years punctuated by 9/11, by a really complete change in the way we fight. the post-Cold War army that I was commissioned in '95 and served as a peacekeeper in Bosnia in the late '90s is a far cry from the type of situations and the type of army that we had become by 2009. And of course, I previously had served in what we call conventional army units, right? I was an MP. My second go around as a commissioned officer, I was serving in a special operations unit. Very different cultures, very different environments. I feel very blessed to have experienced both the Army of the '90s and what we call the GWAT, right? Global War on Terror Army, both the conventional army as an MP, unconventional army, working with SOF, and having a chance to do very different types of missions, peacekeeping versus combat.
So total culture change. Was there a little bit of a shock that you went through in order to make that transition? I mean, what kind of training did they have to basically re-engineer all of your training in addition to get you ready?
Yeah, no, the whole unit, luckily, we mobilized, and then we spent 5 months of training getting ready to go to Afghanistan. So went to a wonderful little National Guard post in Guernsey, Wyoming, which has an uncanny resemblance to Afghanistan, and spent 5 months doing pre-mission training, PMT there. And for me, it was, I literally went from like picking out ties to show to work in the White House to picking out hand grenades to train with and go on patrol with later. And so that 5 months was my reintroduction to the Army, and frankly, my introduction to the special operations world. But it was fantastic. The guys were great. I think they treated me like one of their gorillas and just got me up to speed as quickly as possible. But you're right, it was a culture change. I mean, the Army of the '90s, the post-Cold War Army as an MP that I was used to is very conventional, right? Like run a range by having range cards, and you show up and it's safeties. Special operations, everyone's at least an NCO, and you show up and it's much more what I would call big boy rules, right? You show up at range, you get your weapon, and you just start shooting, right? And you are your own safety. So yeah, bit of a culture shock for me, Bob.
So you go to Afghanistan, and during that time, let's talk a little bit about that. You are in special operations, building relationships with the local population.
Yeah, so there's a saying in the special operations world, right? By, with, and through. So, different special operations unit have different mission sets, different capabilities. The Rangers are the greatest light infantry in the world with expertise in airport takeovers, for example. There's the Air Force pararescue, right, which focus on retrieving down pilots. The Green Berets are really, right, the teachers of the special operations world. The idea is you can drop what they call an ODA, Operation Detachment Alpha, into enemy territory and contested territory, and by itself, that ODA could raise a battalion's strength worth of men and material, right, and make it combat effective. And by fighting by, with, and through them, they're a combat multiplier. So they're supposed to be trainers and teachers first. And so in Afghanistan, that was exactly our mission. So Commander Mike Waltz, right, and myself, and our Green Berets. So we had 6 ODAs on the ground in what they call an ODB, which is the headquarters element for a special operations company. Together, that forms an AOB, an advanced operations base. And our AOB had multiple provinces in eastern Afghanistan. And those ODAs were forwardly placed. I guess there's really no forward, right? The whole country's contested, but they were each partnered with an Afghan partner force, whether it's a Afghan security guard unit, whether it's a commando Kandak, or whether it's a special police unit. Every single one of those ODAs worked alongside, lived with, trained with, and fought, alongside an Afghan unit. And so there's a very close relationship that develops between special operations forces and their partner units. So in my ODB's case, we had an Afghan security guard unit that consisted of a number of highly motivated, highly trained Afghans that accompanied us on all of our operations outside the wire.
So you've now established great relationships with allies within Afghanistan, and you fast forward, the United States decides to pull out of Afghanistan, and all of a sudden the house of cards starts to fall apart, and our Afghan allies are in trouble. Can we talk about what transpired in the summer of 2021 and your perspective, and then what was happening in that August?
Yeah, so even before then, right? I think in my case, I think earlier in 21, I remember getting an email from one of these Afghan security guards I mentioned. And he, sent me his pictures like, look, I work for you, sir. And, I'm trying to get a visa out of the country. Can you help me out? Can you do this paperwork? And so I started working closely with him, his wife, his 8 kids, to try to get them a visa out of the country. And all the while kind of watching the news and noticing like situations worsening, right? Like they're showing these maps of Afghanistan, and the areas held by the Taliban are increasing in color and density, and
right.
the amount of area held by the Afghan Gyroa government is decreasing, right? And so I remember talking to him, as like, look, you really need to find a way out of the country. And this obviously all came to a head in mid-August when the Taliban basically encircled Kabul, and it became clear that Kabul, it's a matter of time, not if, but when. The United States was already in full retrograde, right? We had made the decision earlier that we were leaving Afghanistan no later than September 11th of that year. And so the combination of, the Taliban great strides, them knowing that the Americans were leaving, and then a third factor, which a lot of people don't really consider, we had trained the Afghans to fight like us. So what do I mean by that? They were using our equipment, they're using our tactics, they're used to fighting with close air support. I had a company between my time that we're talking about now and my time in uniform. I helped start a company called MAG Aerospace that trained Afghan pilots to fly helicopters and fly aircraft. We train the Afghans to fight like us. Well, we fight in a way that requires a lot of technology and a lot of equipment. So more than just pulling out our troops, right? At the time, by the time we get to August, right? Yes, the retrograde is in full action. But prior to that, we had pulled out contractor support. We had pulled out all the personnel that maintained their aircraft, that supported their close air support. We pulled out their access to parts, to ammunition for these aircraft. So imagine asking the 82nd Airborne to fight, and then all of a sudden saying, we're going to take away the US Air Force. We're going to, in fact, and you don't have access to the equipment you're used to, right? Like it's we trained to fight it one way, and then we took away their support. So there has been a lot of criticism like, oh, the Afghans should have fought harder. I know many Afghans who fought as hard as they could, but it was an impossible situation, right? We really removed their ability to fight effectively well before August of 21. Anyways, I then start getting some frantic messages, right? That like, Kabul's falling, we need to get out of the country. And by this time, everything had collapsed down to Kabul International Airport, otherwise known as HKIA, Ahmed Karzai International Airport. Right. It was the only way out of the country. It was the only place still held by Americans. And at that point, if you got into the airport, you could get on a plane and get out. If you didn't get in the airport, you're stuck in Afghanistan. And so what we saw for the first time ever was basically a digital Dunkirk, right? This rallying of thousands of people who used the tools of modern technology, Signal and WhatsApp, and sharing information on Google. And they were, because of our 20-year involvement in Afghanistan, we had friends, we had allies, we had people who we worked alongside, people we'd spilled blood alongside, people who had fought along us, asking for our help. And I'm by no means unique in this. Like I said, there are thousands of people who answered those messages and then try to help our Afghan allies get into the airport. So there's this frantic period at the end of August, where hundreds of volunteer groups and thousands of people started helping from halfway around the world, right? People were taking time away from their jobs, sending money, not sleeping for 2 weeks, literally trying to help save lives.
I remember calling you during this period of time and help. I needed something from you, and you were so busy, frantically trying to arrange all of this stuff. What went on? What I mean, so thousands of people trying to get out. What about your specific story? Because you were successful ultimately in secreting away a large group of people through another route. But let's talk about that.
Yeah. So during those last 2 weeks in August, what ended up happening was a lot of groups started sharing information, right? Like go to this gate. Here's where the Taliban checkpoints are. Here's a way to get people in through a bus. And so these ad hoc kind of networks emerged where people would share information, connect with the Afghans that needed help, and try to shepherd them into safety, right? And the group that I became a part of, became the chairman of the board for, Allied Airlift 21, was one such group. There were hundreds. And within a matter of days, we had grown to hundreds of volunteers, veterans, non-veterans, people who had served in Afghanistan, some people who had not. Trying to help hundreds of Afghans, and we ended up getting hundreds of Afghans into the airport. That situation all changed around August 30th, when the U.S. Basically shut down the airport. Right, the Taliban. The decision was made that we're not withdrawing on September 11th. We're going to withdraw sooner. There's a famous picture of Major General Donovan, kind of last boots in the ground in Afghanistan, getting in the aircraft and flying off.
Right.
That left, though the job hadn't been done, right? So as it turns out, while we evacuated, 85,000 people out of the airport to the U.S. In those last 2 weeks, not a lot of those people were SIVs in the category of people who had directly aided the U.S. and were eligible for visa. Not that they weren't deserving, but they just didn't fall into the category. We estimate there's about 150,000 plus people who were allies under the SIV program that were left behind in Afghanistan. And in the immediate aftermath of August, right, early September, those people still were trying to get out. And so through a whole series of events, myself and a few other veterans found ourselves in charge of a group of about 300 of them in buses circling Kabul airport, literally when the US decided we're not taking any more people out. And so we quickly made a decision that, we had two choices. We could either tell them all to go home and try to find your way to safety, which is essentially telling them they're on their own, or we could try to organize something. And so we decided to try to organize something. And there's a town. Yeah, go ahead, Bob.
If France, is that essentially what the U.S. government told them? I mean, by pulling out, I mean, why did the U.S. government decide to abandon the situation before the mission was completed, so to speak?
Yeah, I think the answer to that question, Bob, depends on who you ask, right?
Okay, well,
I will tell you the official answer is that there was a tentative agreement with the Taliban. And if we had stayed longer, right? If you remember, at the end of August, just a few days prior, there'd been a suicide bomber at Abbey Gate who killed 13 Marines and hundreds of Afghans, and killed hundreds of Afghans. There was a concern that the situation was no longer viable for an evacuation, and that if we stayed longer, there would be more lives lost, in particular more American lives. And so it was time to end the operation, that we had done what we could and leave. That is the official explanation on why we left. So, some of us weren't willing to accept that, frankly. Even as the U.S. was pulled out its military and diplomatic forces, we were arranging bus loads of Afghan allies that were in danger. These are people who had worked alongside us and were obvious targets for reprisals by the Taliban. And so we decided to try to evacuate them through another route. And there's a town called Mazar-e-Sharif, which is half a day's journey in a dangerous, windy road. And so we made a decision, we're going to take this group of 300 and take them to Mazar-e-Sharif. and we didn't know what was along the road, whether it was Taliban checkpoints or whatever. We made the decision to take them along the road in the hopes of getting a plane out of Mazar. They arrived there. There was no plane that we could get them out of. And so we ended up housing them, feeding them, keeping them safe for a period of almost 2 weeks before we could arrange through the US government for approval for a private charter flight out. And so on September 17th, the group I was involved in managed to organize and get approved the very first US approved private charter evacuation flight out of Afghanistan after the US left Kabul. And so, a plane lifted in the skies with 380 Afghan allies on it, 152 children, 93 families. And I'm happy to say, Bob, that every single one of those people has already started a new life in the United States.
The Mission Oriented podcast is sponsored by Transact Capital Partners. Transact Capital Partners is a full-service mergers and acquisitions advisory firm specializing in the confidential sale and acquisition of privately owned mid-tier businesses. At Transact Capital Partners, we believe that our veterans continue to lead impactful lives as civic and business leaders. Their leadership and management skills, hardened in the crucible of the military, are key drivers of success. Veterans are mentally tough team players and creative problem solvers imbued with a heightened sense of ethics and personal accountability. Transact Capital Partners is committed to supporting veteran business owners throughout the life of their companies, building professional relationships and networks, advising on capital formation, mergers, and acquisitions. Contact the veterans on our team, Matt Kane, Ross Harris, and Bob Louthan at transactcapital.com. You're listening to the Mission Oriented podcast on the VeteranCrowd Network. My guest is France Hoang. France, I've got to drill down on just the logistics of that just a little bit. You say
Sure.
that you protected those people. You had to house them for several weeks. Who went into Afghanistan? Were there veterans that returned to Afghanistan and went in to help?
So,
am I breaching security protocols here in some form or fashion? But
so there were certain different groups took different efforts, right? Different ways of helping Afghans. We worked by, with, and through the Afghans that are already on the ground, and the organizations. It was a kind of a partnership between some nonprofits and some private companies that organized the flight I just talked about and kept these Afghans. Ended up being about 400 Afghans that we were housing. Other groups did have people on the ground, is my understanding. Other groups, worked from other countries. We did not have anybody directly on the ground in terms of Americans, but we had trusted people that we had worked alongside with. One of the things about, Americans having been in Afghanistan for 20 plus years, we have 20 years of relationships, right? 20 years of organizations and networks. And what you saw in August and September of 21 was people pulling in every card they had, any chits they had, any relationship they could leverage to save lives. It was an extraordinary coming together. And so, we happen to have a relationship, with a bus provider. We happen to have relationships with people who could arrange for an aircraft. We had relationships with people who could house people. And so, we set up, transportation and safe housing and a plane for almost 400 Afghans from half a world away.
That seems astounding to me. And was there, direct interference from the Taliban at every step and every turn here as you guys were working your way through this, or?
Yeah, so to get a plane off the ground from Afghanistan, right, we needed multiple approvals. We needed the Taliban to approve it because it was their country, right? We needed US approval for them to land at a US airbase, right, and process and take these refugees. We needed Qatari approval to fly into Qatari airspace. And so part of the challenge wasn't just getting a plane, like physically renting a plane or chartering a plane and getting it there. It was also all the approvals necessary to get these people to safety. And what's interesting is, so when we say Taliban, right, it's, there's Taliban and then there's Taliban, right? Like there's different groups of Taliban. And, I wouldn't say they were friendly, but there's a more moderate group that was in control of Mazar-e Sharif. And we were working closely with a company in Afghanistan that had good relationships all around, and they're an economic force. And so that helped us get our plane off the ground.
Just the cultural and tribal relationships, I think, are pretty complicated in Afghanistan. So is Allied Airlift 21 and Afghanistan Departure Group, are they still active? What's going on with those two organizations?
Yeah, so they're both still active in the sense that they're trying to help Afghans out. Allied Airlift 21 continues to advise Afghans on legal routes for immigration. At this point, the movement and resettlement of Afghans out of Afghanistan is being done by the USG. There are some exceptions, some small handful of exceptions where people go into other countries or doing other routes. Allied Airlift 21 works exclusively with Afghans who have a legal route out, right? So what are the legal routes out right now, right? The SIV program, the I-130, visa, in some cases, right, P1, P2s, those are hard. These are all different kind of immigration categories. Afghan Departure Group organized that flight out that I talked about, and has worked to get other flights out. Unfortunately, stars didn't line up, but it's still around to kind of support operations where it can. There's still, at the height of the Afghanistan evacuation, there's a group called Afghan Evac. They estimate there's about 250 groups active. There's still a large number of groups that are active helping our Afghan allies get out, because like I said, I was recently in the New York Times article, and I said that the failure of our Afghanistan withdrawal wasn't just a failure in the rearview mirror in August of 21. The failure is happening now, right? There are over 100,000 Afghans that put their lives and the lives of their families in harm's way by fighting alongside us and serving alongside us that are in Afghanistan, right? And I would argue that we have a moral obligation to help them. We have set up a legal system, the SIV program, to get them out, so they have a legal channel. I also think it's in our own self-interest, Bob. I mean, as a veteran as well, yeah. We have a national security imperative. If we want, you mentioned by, with, and through earlier. If we want allies in the future to fight alongside our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines, and serve alongside our diplomats and work alongside our intelligence community, they need to believe that we're going to stand alongside them as well. And so how we treat our Afghan allies today has significant national security implications for how we operate in the future. Because if people aren't willing to fight by, with, and through us, then we're going to have to go it alone. And so, while we lost 2,600, I believe, veterans, and over 3,000 contractors in Afghanistan, the Afghans themselves lost 10 times more. So, the alternative to us fighting by, with, and through is doing it alone and taking all those casualties and all those risks using American lives. And
this is absolutely a strategic imperative to us to honor the commitments that we made to these allies.
Yeah. Right.
And I think you made this statement before Congress. I think you got asked that question directly. And do you think that the U.S. government in the last now almost 20 months, I guess, is maybe stepping up its game a little bit in hindsight, or is there still a lot to be desired?
So I think it's both. I will tell you that there were any number of people on the ground and bureaucrats back here in the States that were just as outraged, that felt just as much moral outrage as myself and veterans and other volunteers did at what happened to our Afghan allies. They were in a better position in some cases to make a difference. I'm talking about the guard at the gate at HKIA who's letting people in. I'm talking about the bureaucrat at Foggy Bottom who was pushing hard for a policy change, right? They all advocated in their own way. They are also hamstrung by being in a bureaucracy because bureaucracies move slow. They don't like novel situations. And this tested and broke our bureaucracies, right? We were not prepared, unfortunately, to handle this as a government. Since then, right, the US government has stepped in. They have set up a flight system. They are processing SIVs. That being said, there's a lot more to be done, Bob.
Is the Taliban cooperating to any degree on that end, or are they stonewalling and negotiating for every nickel that they can squeeze out of us? I'm curious.
So it's an interesting tension. So let's be clear, it's their country. We're not doing anything without their consent, right?
Right.
It's not like we're flying in charter aircraft in the middle of the night and sneaking people out of Afghanistan, right? Nobody is leaving Afghanistan without their consent. And so we have no choice but to work through the Taliban to get our allies out, right? And to resettle them here. At the same time, we are well aware, right, through communications that unfortunately are still coming in my inbox today, that there is an effort, right, to seek reprisals against those Afghans that served alongside Americans. So they are both helping and hurting, right? And it's one of the conundrums of this entire operation. To your point, your question earlier about is there more to be done? To put this in context, and obviously I feel this all deeply because 45 years ago, I was that person right. Being evacuated, right, by American forces. And so history's kind of come full circle in my own personal story here. Here I am helping our next generation of allies come to the United States. In the decades following the fall of Saigon, right, we have brought well over 1 million, maybe 1.5 million Vietnamese allies to the United States. And that effort spanned not months, not years, but decades, right? There's a program called the Orderly Departure Program. It didn't close down until 1995. 20 years after Saigon, we still had a program in place to bring out Afghan allies. And 1.5 million Vietnamese, right, have resettled in the United States because of these programs. We've brought, a little over 100,000 Afghans, and it's just a couple of years later. So to put this in context, right, there's still a lot more work to be done, and we can do it. And I know this because we've done it as a people, right? There is one truth about America, which is when we set our mind to something, we get it done. And so we should set our mind to getting our Afghan allies out and resettled here.
How can the listeners of this podcast help? The average person that's sitting there, gosh, I want to do something about this. What do they do?
Yeah, first, call your congressman or senator, make your views known, right? So there's still a lot of actions that need to be taken at the legislative level. And they care about what you care about, and you have a voice, and so make it heard. Second, there are still organizations in place, Allied Airlift 21, No One Left Behind, that are still involved in helping Afghan allies navigate the bureaucratic process and logistical hurdles in getting out. Think about donating, think about volunteering or getting involved in those organizations. Third, there are Afghans that are here now, like I said, right? Probably over 100,000, I don't know the exact count, resettled across the United States, and they need help getting resettled. When my family arrived here, we started in processing at Camp Pendleton. Governor Evans from Washington State made a sirens call, said, "You're all welcome to Washington." And so we came to Washington State. Catholic Charities assigned us to a sponsor family, the Petersons, Don and Mary Peterson of Olympia, Washington. They took us in. They helped us get on our feet. Me and my family owe an unpayable debt of gratitude to them, right? Every listener could be that family for an Afghan family. And so that's the other way to reach out to your, every city, every major city has an organization that is helping Afghans resettle, and they need people to volunteer. It could be as little as bringing a meal. It could be as much as adopting a family and helping them get, settled here in the United States. And so that's the final way to be involved.
France, I can't thank you enough. I mean, for your story is inspirational. You certainly have the moral authority to deliver this message. You're someone who has lived it and someone who stepped up. Thank you so much for what you do. I'm humbled to be able to call you my friend, and I really do appreciate what you're doing.
Well, thanks, Bob. I mean, I think the real credit here needs to go to these brave Afghan men and women and families who are, they are paying the price for having served alongside us. But they want what we all want, right? Which is an opportunity for a better life. And they are exactly the kind of people that will make great Americans someday. And maybe 20 years from now, one of them will be on a Bob podcast with another Bob Lawton talking about what an amazing place America is, right? Because
headed to West Point and VMI to serve our country.
That's right.
Hey, well, thanks so much, France. You've been listening to the Mission Oriented podcast on the Veteran Crowd Network. Again, my guest has been France Hoang. France, I cannot thank you enough for everything that you've been doing. Thanks so much for spending some time with us today to share this story. I'll throw out the Army Bravo Zulu to you for your performance today. And that's a wrap.
Thank you for listening to Mission Oriented. Make sure to hit the subscribe button and you won't miss an episode. To learn more about Mission Oriented and the Veteran Crowd Network, visit us at www.veterancrowdnetwork.com.